Welcome to the C-Suite Sales and Marketing Perspectives podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. And today we've got a really interesting conversation with Venkat Patla. Now, Venkat, you are a CMO, but you've got an interesting background that brings you to the office of the CMO. To start with, you are a trained mechanical engineer. You're probably in the top 0.1% of CMOs that have a mechanical engineering degree. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that influences the way that you think as a CMO, because I think that's really interesting. You've spent a lot of time in the B2C world, in the B2B world, and we all know how important the expectations from the world of B2C have influenced now the world of B2B. And so there's a lot of cross learning there. You've also been on kind of both sides of the fence, right? You're in enterprise now, you've been in an agency environment before, so you've served and serve as the role of CMO in an enterprise. So the last thing is you also live in the world of finance and compliance and a lot of other regulations and stipulations that in a lot of industries we don't have. But how you live through that, yet innovate and create and drive the business forward in that kind of an environment, it's going to be a big part of what we talk about. But I'd love to hear a little bit more from you and your background before we get started. And when we do, we're going to talk about why CMOs fail when they rush instead of reflect. And I think that's a really important thing because we all know how the speed of business goes and expectations from the board and lightning speed. It's not a slow path to success that we're being required to pave ahead of us. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I mean, I'm really pleased and thankful for you having me on today. So appreciate that. I'm looking forward to this conversation. If you want to talk a little bit about my background and my engineering degree, if you will, I grew up in a generation when in India, and I grew up in India in a generation when you could be one of three things. You could be a doctor, you could be an engineer, or you could be a total failure. And I was pushed into engineering by my parents, if you will. I thoroughly enjoyed it, being in engineering college and studying mechanical engineering overall. But that's how I ended up. And I was lucky enough to get into engineering school. It's highly competitive back in India, and I was lucky enough to get in. So it was a good fallback option if I indeed failed within the advertising business, which is really where I wanted to end up in. And that's what I did. I never for a day worked as a mechanical engineer. So right after I got out, and I was working as a copywriter in this racket.
It's interesting. I'd love to have a conversation with your parents about helping you get into and succeed in a mechanical engineering degree and then come out as a copywriter. I was too, by my parents, pushed into an engineering degree that I didn't use. So it's interesting. I would love to start us off learning a little bit more about your background in B2C and B2B, that experience, and how does that reshape the way that you think about connecting with customers and creating experience for customers today?
Just being a mechanical engineer just meant that, when I got into this business, all the copywriters and creative directors and creative people who didn't want to work on things that were industrial in nature or B2B in nature just ended up in my lap because they said, this is complicated, complex. You're an engineer, you can take it, right? While they thought they were getting rid of accounts that they didn't want to work on, for me, it was all just interesting work. Yes, it helped that I had a mechanical engineering degree that helped with understanding some of the more complex challenges and problems. But I ultimately saw this as solving any sort of a communication problem, whether I'm talking to an engineer or an anesthesiologist or any person, or even someone who's in the construction business. For me, I'm having a conversation one-on-one with them. And I wanted to make sure that I connected with them on a human level. So that's what I continue to believe in. So I never really made distinctions between one form of advertising or the other right from the beginning. And I still continue to do things much the same way.
really interesting. The parallels are just interesting here. I turned down a job at Microsoft. My brother was a VP there, SVP, and he reminds me all the time how much my net worth would have been. But I turned it down because at the time, Microsoft was a B2B company, and I had my sights set on big things. I started out in Madison Avenue, New York, and ad agencies. And so I get the idea of how B2B used to be, the stepchild, yet it's incredible. This whole podcast is for B2B C suite executives. And the way that we understand and create relationships and understand empathy and emotional decisions that are being made every single day, these people are making decisions that a lot of times put their careers on the line. These are big risk items that they're taking, and large sums of money is going into this. So at the same time, though, they have the same set, they're adopting a lot of the same expectations from the B2C world. And then those expectations are changing again with AI and it was digital transformation. There's always something here. So what I'd love to know is like, what is the learning from B2C that you think translates over well into B2B and that we can learn from?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, I've never really made the distinction between the two very much. Um, so if there is a learning or a connection that we all need to make, is we are people trying to solve certain challenges, whether it's within life or within our careers. We are faced with a challenge and a problem each and every single day some of them are long-term problems, some of them are immediate decisions that you need to make, but at every moment you're making a decision, you're trying to solve for something. So as long as you're solving those things in a human way, you're not wearing a different hat when you go into the office and suddenly your entire construct and your experience and mindset changes. You're still trying to solve a problem for the firm and for the company. So it's the same thing when you're trying to buy a car. You are trying to address a certain need of yours. I think that's the way you need to really address any sort of a challenge. And from a communication standpoint, address it very much the same way. Put on your thinking cap, be rational about it, much as we are irrational human beings. Just be aware of the information in front of you to be able to solve the problem that you're solving in the best way that you know with the information that you have gathered.
I love how you left it off here on the information you've gathered, because some of the most important information is the voice of highest authority in our business or customers. And nobody's ever going to say, we're not a customer first business. We're not a customer obsessed business, right? So by nature, we're defining ourselves as somebody that listens very intently, very closely to our customers. That you talked about the customer paradox, that we have to listen very intently, but we also just can't follow blindly. And I'd love to dig into what you meant by that and make those distinctions there.
Yeah, I mean, I think you ought to listen to the customer. You have to have those conversations with your clients, customers, consumers, whatever you want to call them, but you need to really be able to walk in their shoes, see the problems they're seeing. But when we ask a client or a customer what they're looking for, if you talk about cell phones, they'll likely give you a feature that is lacking or a certain something that something very specific that is minor and minute rather than follow that blindly. You got to dig into the insights that are driving it, right? Let me give you an example. And it's an example I'm sure that people are familiar with and have heard before, but I think it's apt to use in this instance. If Henry Ford had asked, a farmer, I hope I'm recalling this correctly, they would have said, I want faster horses. But they could never have imagined that you could have an automobile driven by a mechanical device, really, driven by gasoline. So, which is what he came up in some ways with, right? So that's the power of being able to listen to the customer, but also dive into the insight. I mean, the same thing you can say about the iPhone. If Steve Jobs is famously uh, known to say that customers don't know what they want until they see it, right? So we are all constrained by the models that we have in our heads, and don't always have the power to articulate what the problem is in the best way possible. If Steve Jobs had listened, we wouldn't have had the iPhone today. We'd still be on little keyboards. So that's what I mean. You've got to be able to pay attention to what the clients are saying, walk in their shoes, but also step outside of it and really think about how to solve an existing challenge in the most interesting way possible.
So here's what's interesting about that. 100%, right? I remember, when Steve Jobs said that like no focus group would have come up with like, let's lose the little keypad, right? Like we don't need this keypad thing, right? Never would have happened. It's interesting though. So McKinsey came out with a study a couple of years ago, and they said that less than 15% of companies are actually executing well on a voice of customer program. And what part of what that means to me, and I take away from our conversation here, is we have to maintain our role as visionaries, right? Like the customers weren't thinking about iPad or iPhones or just phones in general at the level that Apple was thinking about it, with intentions of innovating on a product, right? That's not what they do. But we can't lack that. We give up our role as visionaries in making life better for our customers. But at the same time, we also a lot of companies spend almost all of their time as thought leaders of their own tech, their own product, their own services. And what that study from McKinsey said is we spend very little time actually learning from our customers. And I just love to, I think you and I had talked before, and I gave you I asked on a scale of 1 to 10, like how important is the voice of the customer and understanding that? Because I think we lean heavy on being visionaries and not as heavy on being really curious about our customers and learning from our customers.
Right. I mean, I think it is crucial to listen to the customer. So don't get me wrong, right? I mean, you have to listen to the customers, and I said you have to be able to. You are a consumer yourself. We ourselves are, right? So we know, but we're not putting on these, the moment we get into assemble people in an artificial sort of a setting and say, opine on something, now we are forced to opine on it in a very swift fashion. So I take, listening to the voice of the customer as day in and day out, having a cocktail, keeping your eyes peeled, observe, see what's happening, see when someone's using your product, pay attention to how they're using it, see if there's a little bit of frustration around how they, handling something. That's where I think being constantly looped into it and observing and listening and having conversations, even outside of artificial settings, those things are important. Focus groups can give you a fair amount of information, but I think to truly understand the customer, you need to see them in their actual environments and how they're using the products, rather than just basing decisions on a few focus groups.
Absolutely. You said something in there. It's like we're all customers, right? And this is a B2B podcast, and we're all B2B customers too. You're a buyer every time you buy services like to enhance your MarTech stack, right? So what's interesting is I don't know how much we learn from ourselves being a buyer. Like we are B2B buyers and we're selling to B2B buyers. And we rarely think about things like, the people we're selling to, they're not professional buyers. They're like, if you're selling to, I just talked to a gentleman that his main ICP was a CISO, right? And like the role of a CISO is not a buyer. The role that he spends or she spends 98% of his or her time on has nothing to do with buying tech or buying services, right? They're a CISO, and that takes up more than their time. Like, so you make me think about that from the perspective of not only are we customers in a B2C world, we're customers in our own B2B world. And like, what do you think we can learn ourselves from being a buyer and going through that experience that we can take forward into like, how do we address the buying journey when we're now trying to influence our own buyers?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you need to understand it. The B2B buying journey may be a lot more complicated and complex and have more, maybe more layered and nuanced than, buying something that is of less consequence on a personal level, right? Buying a latte doesn't bear too much consequence. But when you're plunking down a few $1,000s or $100,000 on a piece of marketing stack, a piece of software from a licensing perspective, then you need to really be paying attention to general utility of the product, but also, how is it going to bring in the efficiencies and the knowledge that the firm requires to make decisions in a very informed sort of a way, right? How is it adding to the benefit of the firm moving forward? I think is important. But when you're talking about the C-suite audiences, they're not always the users of the product. So you have to bring in the people that are the actual users of the product and what their experiences are in using one versus the other, right? So I'll give you an example from a long time ago when we were selling Avis rentals, not to the consumer directly, but to B2B, the IBMs of the world, right? Or Microsofts of the world. How do we make Avis the preferred partner for those services? So we went through not one buyer journey all the way to the people that are ultimately going to sign the check. We went through the entire sequence of how do we do it for the HR person? What does that experience look like from a CFO perspective? What does it look like for the procurement people? What are they paying for? What are they trying to solve for? We mapped every single journey and we developed communications to those people. So it's important ultimately when the CFO is signing off on the dotted line that he's making decisions based on all of those people's priorities, including not wanting any complaints coming from the people who are going to use the product when they're on a business travel. You don't want to hear complaints saying that this company sucks. So I think that's important to keep in mind overall, that you're listening to the right people to make the right decisions.
You had also meant you made a distinction before of listening versus observation, right? And that with observation, there are some things that customers can't or really articulate. It's hard to learn from them by listening to them versus observing them. And I'd love to know a little bit more about, how you think about that.
I'll give you another example from a long time ago. So there was this product designer who was generally, you go to the supermarket and you buy fruit, right? So now you see these little labels on the fruit because sometimes when you're going out for lunch, you want one apple, one piece of banana, and every one of those has a sticker on it that has a barcode. So the checkout person can scan the barcode and take it away. But when you buy an apple, if it's an orange, that's easier. But when you buy something like an apple you've got a sticker on it, it's got sticking into the flesh, you dig your nail into it and peel it out. That's not a really good experience. So one of these product designers noted that, how do I solve for this? And came up with this notion of making the sticker, and there's glue sometimes that's left behind. So the glue is edible. So he designed glue that was edible, and he designed the sticker in such a way that you can actually consume it, eat it, right? So that comes from experiencing it and then translating it into something that is useful ultimately. So that is coming from the power of observation that he saw people peeling this off, constantly digging into the flesh of the fruit, damaging it, and turn that into an insight that then helped come up with the product.
I love that. There's always more to learn from a customer, right? The world changes around us. Our ICP is complex and always changing. So we always have to be a student of our customers, right? And we can never stop. Tell me about, though, how do you do all of this at the speed of leadership and expectations in a board, amongst the C-suite. I mean, nobody's sitting around and saying, you got a decent amount of time. I want you to think really carefully about this and let's implement methodically. It's usually like you go into the board meeting and it's like, well, how is this quarter's quota doing? And what's the next quarter looking like? Right? It's a very short-term biased environment. But as CMOs, we're also in charge of the brand, right? And that's not a throwaway. Brand is a trust mark. And trust is at the core foundation of a B2B relationship. So this is not something to take lightly. But how do you balance that? Like, how do you do that dance?
Well, you have to do things these days with a sense of urgency, I think, right? I mean, I think the world is only speeding up, not slowing down. But you have to utilize moments where you reflect on it. I mean, I think break things, fail fast is all good sort of information, and it's the right way in some ways to do it. Just because someone says fail fast doesn't mean you just do things in a thoughtless fashion. I think it's all the more important that you reflect on it and think about it before you go out there and put something that is mediocre or half-assed, right? We now have the tools to execute with a certain sense of urgency without sacrificing some of that thoughtfulness, right? For example, I can do a focus group using AI and using a synthetic focus group. I did this with my own creative recently, right? So I said, these are the personas, assemble, did a study design, and I asked the AI to develop a focus group and did a bunch of focus group and fed it the creative. And there it was, I could get a whole bunch of feedback. You got to take it with a pinch of salt and use human judgment, and all of those things are very much true. You can't escape the urgency with which we need to turn things around, but it just means you have to be more thoughtful, more careful that you're actually putting out work that is meaningful and authentic to people to absorb, despite the urgency that's placed on us.
I've never heard of that idea. There's something to be learned about that, but an AI generated focus group and feedback. That's really interesting. That's actually a very interesting conversation to have.
Absolutely. I mean, this is being done. I mean, I actually first heard about it from a professor at Northeastern University that started developing, Nick Bear Brown, who's developing some, programs and working in AI. So he was the first one who pointed out to me that you can build these synthetic focus groups and studies, and now it's a thing.
So you had mentioned something that, you said, I'm not a type A personality. I think through things that can frustrate people, but it's important to get to the right decision. So this is a parallel conversation or question from what we just talked about here. But everyone wants well thought through strategy. They just want it happening at the pace of AI these days. And I'm sure you've had questions from others in the C-suite or the board and, Venkat, what's your AI strategy? Because the expectation is you're going to get a lot more done a lot quicker. And I literally just finished a podcast recording last week where four-time B2B CMO, and she said, the expectation of value from our board of what we can provide to our customers and the speed is directly relational to the expectation that our customers have, right? That it's changed the way that they expect that we can do what we do and how we can elevate the amount of value that we provide to them. I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Well, we've all had the experience of the world speeding up, so to speak, in every way, shape, and form. And today, AI is that sort of magic bullet people think it is. But AI certainly doesn't have imagination. It certainly doesn't have judgment. And I think we as human beings still need to put that into anything that we do, even if we lean on AI for certain research or certain ideas and brainstorming. But the imagination really comes from what we do. I've realized, despite all these tools that we have at our disposal, you can't rush things. Old Murphy's Law, things take as long as they do, is still very true. I think that just because you've done something Fast doesn't mean it's the right thing that you've done. Things will take the time they do, um, at least to get it right. You have to go through the motions and the iterations to be able to fix things along the way. We have so much big data, technology, AI, all of this. We've gone through, we are in this information and intelligence age, artificial intelligence age. But there's an old adage from John Wanamaker uh, that holds true even today. And he said, I know half my advertising dollars go to waste. I just don't know which half. And I'm dealing with that today with all the data that's available to me. Fundamentally, things will take as long as they do, and you still won't have all the answers that you want to make the best decisions. But you have the luxury of experience, I think, and you have to be able to use that to make good judgment calls.
I've got one last question because we've talked about so much here, and our poor human brains can only remember about two or three things at a time. And so I'd love to ask you if, to your C-suite peer community, if there was one thing that you said, I want to make sure they take this away from our conversation, what would that one thing be?
There's a lot I could say on that front. I would say be reflective, be thinking about how this is going to show up, be truthful to what you want to accomplish. Don't forget the long-term picture. And I'm from the Gen X cohort, if you will, and Douglas Rushkoff, a professor, I think, in Canada, said this beautifully: don't contribute to the dung heap of history. And I don't want to contribute to the dung heap of history. Anything that I put out there, I want it to have some sort of a redeeming value. And I think you want that for your customers and clients. You have to afford them the respect, the intelligence, particularly in the B2B space, in any space, right? You've got to be able to give your customers the information to be able to make good judgments and good calls. The product that you may be selling or you have to offer may not be right for them. And that's totally fine. And this brings me to just reminded me of another personal adage of mine where I say you can't persuade people. Persuasion is just another form of coercion in my book. This is based on my experience. But I think you can attract people to your way. So don't sell it. Don't sell anything. Let people come into your fold. So there's no buyer's remorse. You're inviting them into the conversation.
I love that. I think I read the stat recently that 60% of B2B buyers have remorse after making their decision. They probably rushed into it, although we felt like it took way, way too long. I have to tell you the mission of the podcast here is to bring different perspectives and different insights from years of experience. And if we can do that, from different C-suite perspectives, then it's like the rising tide that lifts all boats. And I thought you were amazing part of that rising tide today. So I just wanted to say thank you for coming on and sharing with us.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. So thank you. And I hope that some of these perspectives are useful for other people. Love your podcast. I love coming to get to know you. So thank you for doing what you do.